Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in and let's begin. The desert wind carried whispers of the dead as Célestine Moreau sat in her weathered rocking chair on the porch of her adobe house, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the Phantom Ridge Trail disappeared into darkness that had swallowed her husband 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. Every midnight for over 1,000 nights, she had taken her vigil in this same spot, clutching the silver locket that contained Antoine's photograph, while listening for hoofbeats that never came, and watching for dust clouds that never rose from the trail where he had vanished during what should have been a simple ride to Amaranth Creek for supplies that their isolated homestead desperately needed. The townspeople of Esperanza Flats had long since given up trying to convince her that Antoine Moreau was dead. Killed by bandits or Apache raiders, or any of the dozen deadly possibilities that frontier life offered to men who rode alone through territory where civilization was measured in miles between graves rather than comfort between neighbors. Her neighbors' well-meaning visits had dwindled to occasional awkward encounters when necessity forced them to acknowledge the widow who refused to accept widowhood, while their whispered conversations branded her as touched by desert madness that claimed minds when grief exceeded human capacity for acceptance of loss that frontier existence demanded with ruthless frequency. The routine that had sustained her through endless nights of waiting included careful maintenance of Antoine's belongings as if he might return at any moment, while their small ranch continued operating through her stubborn determination to preserve everything exactly as he had left it on that morning, when he had kissed her goodbye and promised to return before sunset with news from town and supplies for winter that was approaching with inevitable threat of isolation that could last for months. The garden that she tended produced enough food for survival, while the few cattle that remained provided milk and occasional meat that solitary existence required for maintaining life that had lost all meaning except for hope that sustained her vigil. The silver watch that chimed midnight had belonged to Antoine's father, and its mechanical precision marked the moment each night when her vigil began in earnest, while the desert around her transformed from merely empty into actively haunted by memories and dreams that blurred the line between hope and delusion in ways that prolonged grief had made indistinguishable from reality. The coyotes that called from distant hills seemed to echo her loneliness, while stars that witnessed her nightly ritual provided silent testimony to devotion that exceeded rational limits, while maintaining emotional truth that love couldn't abandon simply because circumstances demanded practical acceptance of permanent loss. Tonight felt different in ways that she couldn't articulate, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, while invisible forces gathered strength for revelation that would either vindicate her faith or shatter the last fragile threads that connected her sanity to hope that had sustained her through years of solitary waiting. When the sound of approaching wheels echoed across the silence with impossible clarity, followed by the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to shake the earth beneath her chair, Célestine's heart stopped for one eternal moment before beginning to race with recognition that after 3 years of faithful waiting, something was finally answering her prayers. Though whether salvation or damnation approached through the midnight darkness remained terrifyingly unclear as spectral shapes materialized from moonlight and shadow. 3 years and 4 months earlier, Antoine Moreau had stood in this same spot where Célestine now maintained her vigil, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders as he made the promise that had become both anchor and torment for her lonely existence in desert isolation that tested human endurance through scorching days and freezing nights when survival depended on determination that exceeded mere stubbornness. His words had been simple but absolute. No matter what happened, No matter how long it took, he would find a way to return to her because their love was stronger than death itself, and their bond transcended any obstacle that fate might place between them. The homestead that they had built together represented everything that frontier marriage could achieve when mutual devotion combined with practical cooperation to create sanctuary from harsh world that measured human worth through survival rather than sentiment. While their small adobe house had been constructed with careful attention to defense and comfort that reflected Antoine's military experience and Célestine's determination to create civilization in wilderness that challenged every assumption about domestic tranquility and feminine refinement. The garden that flourished under her care provided vegetables that supplemented hunting and trading, while the well that Antoine had dug by hand ensured water supply that made their isolated location habitable despite distance from town and neighbors. The happiness that had filled their early marriage exceeded anything either had imagined possible when loneliness and practical necessity had brought them together through correspondence that had evolved into genuine affection and then passionate love that transformed convenience into profound partnership worthy of any sacrifice that frontier existence might demand from couples whose survival depended on absolute trust and mutual support. Their conversations during long winter evenings had revealed shared dreams about expanding their ranch and eventually starting family that could continue their legacy of determination and love in territory where such achievements required courage that exceeded normal human limitations. The morning that had shattered their peaceful existence began like countless others, with routine chores and casual conversation about supplies needed from town and plans for completing winter preparations, that seasonal urgency was making essential for survival during months when travel would become impossible and self-sufficiency would determine whether spring would find them alive or merely preserved by desert cold until discovery by travelers who might wonder about their story. Antoine's departure had been delayed by affectionate farewell and last-minute instructions about household tasks that his absence would require her to handle alone. While his promise to return before dark had been offered with casual confidence of man whose experience with territorial dangers had never included possibility of permanent separation. The sunset that had passed without his return marked beginning of vigil that had consumed her life through seasons that had transformed hope into obsession and love into torment that rational minds would have abandoned long ago. While her refusal to accept his death had preserved emotional connection that transcended logic and challenged every assumption about healthy grief and practical acceptance of loss that frontier communities considered essential for survival. The promise that had sustained her through endless nights of waiting had become both blessing and curse, offering comfort while preventing healing that would have allowed her to rebuild life that his disappearance had frozen in time like photograph that captured moment before tragedy destroyed everything worth preserving. The delegation that arrived at Célestine's homestead on the first anniversary of Antoine's disappearance was led by Father Michel Dubois, whose responsibility for spiritual welfare of frontier Catholics had made him witness to grief that exceeded normal human capacity for endurance, while his pastoral experience had taught him to recognize difference between healthy mourning and dangerous obsession that threatened both spiritual and physical survival. The priest's gentle manner and genuine concern were accompanied by Dr. Bernard Rousseau, whose medical knowledge included understanding of mental conditions that prolonged isolation and unresolved grief could create in minds that had been pushed beyond their capacity for rational acceptance of permanent loss. The concern that motivated their visit was shared throughout Esperanza Flats, where Célestine's midnight vigils had become source of both sympathy and unease among neighbors whose own experience with frontier hardships had taught them that survival required practical acceptance of loss rather than romantic devotion to impossible hopes that could destroy sanity and endanger life through neglect of realistic necessities. The townspeople's discussions about her situation revealed mixture of admiration for her faithfulness and worry about her welfare that caring communities felt obligated to address when individual suffering exceeded private concern into territory requiring intervention that friendship and Christian duty demanded. The conversation that was attempted during their visit included gentle suggestions about accepting Antoine's death and practical advice about selling property and moving to town where social contact and community support could provide healing that solitary existence was preventing through isolation that fed delusion rather than encouraged recovery from trauma that required human connection and spiritual guidance for healthy resolution. Father Dubois' offer of special prayers and memorial service was presented with sincere desire to help her find closure and peace that continued waiting was making impossible while endangering her health and spiritual welfare. The resistance that their well-meaning intervention encountered was both polite and absolute, as Célestine's conviction about Antoine's eventual return had crystallized into faith that exceeded religious belief through personal certainty, that challenged rational argument while revealing depth of love that inspired reluctant admiration, even among those who considered her hope dangerously unrealistic. Her articulate defense of her position and obvious intelligence made dismissing her beliefs as simple madness impossible, while her physical health and practical management of ranch affairs demonstrated competence that complicated easy conclusions about mental incapacity that would justify forced intervention. The departure of concerned visitors left her more isolated than before, as community recognition of her determination to continue waiting created social distance that transformed sympathy into avoidance, while establishing pattern of respectful non-interference that allowed her obsession to continue unchallenged by external pressure or practical necessity that might have forced realistic acceptance of widowhood. The unspoken agreement among townspeople to respect her choice while avoiding encouragement of what they considered dangerous delusion created situation where her vigil could continue indefinitely without community support or interference that might have provided opportunity for healing that solitary existence was systematically preventing. The first supernatural occurrence that challenged Célestine's rational understanding of her situation happened 6 months after the community's unsuccessful intervention, when she discovered fresh hoofprints in the dust outside her house that appeared overnight despite her careful observation of approaches to her property and absence of any known travelers in region whose isolation made unexpected visitors virtually impossible without advance notice through network of ranchers and townspeople who monitored movement through territory where strangers were rare and potentially dangerous. The prints were distinctive in size and pattern, matching exactly the shoes of Antoine's horse, César, whose characteristics she knew as intimately as her own heartbeat. The investigation that she conducted with systematic thoroughness revealed no logical explanation for tracks that seemed to materialize from emptiness while following path that Antoine would have taken from Phantom Ridge Trail to their house, while the depth and clarity of impressions suggested recent passage by horse carrying substantial weight, despite absence of any other evidence for visitors who should have been visible or audible in desert environment where sound carried for miles and dust clouds marked travelers long before their arrival. The mystery deepened when tracking revealed that prints ended abruptly at their usual hitching post, without any indication of departure or continuation that would explain how horse and rider had vanished without trace. The second incident occurred during winter storm that had trapped her in-house for 3 days, when she heard distinct sound of Antoine's voice calling her name through wind that howled around adobe walls with fury that made normal communication impossible even between people in same room. The clarity and unmistakable timbre of voice that had whispered endearments and shared dreams for years of happy marriage created emotional response that transcended rational skepticism while challenging her sanity in ways that isolation and grief had been steadily undermining through months of solitary existence that blurred boundaries between memory and reality. The pattern that emerged through subsequent months included increasingly frequent supernatural manifestations that defied rational explanation, while providing comfort and encouragement that sustained her vigil through trials that would have broken weaker spirits or more practical minds that valued survival over romantic devotion to impossible dreams. The appearances of familiar objects in unexpected locations, sounds of hoofbeats that ceased when she investigated, and glimpses of movement that resembled Antoine's silhouette, created accumulating evidence for supernatural intervention that either validated her faith or confirmed her descent into madness that prolonged grief and isolation had made inevitable. The documentation that she began maintaining in journal included detailed records of each supernatural occurrence with systematic attention to date, time, weather conditions, and her emotional state during experiences that challenged everything she had been taught about death and reality, while providing hope that transcended rational understanding and sustained determination that exceeded normal human capacity for endurance. When neighbors occasionally glimpsed lights moving around her property during nights when no rational explanation could account for illumination, their reports added external confirmation to experiences that might otherwise have been dismissed as products of lonely imagination and desperate hope that had created delusions indistinguishable from supernatural intervention. The investigation that Célestine finally undertook into Antoine's disappearance began 2 years after his vanishing, when accumulated supernatural experiences had provided courage to seek answers that grief and fear had previously made too painful to pursue actively. The Phantom Ridge Trail that had claimed her husband was notorious throughout territorial Arizona for mysterious disappearances that exceeded normal frontier dangers through pattern of vanishings that left no trace of victims or explanation for their fate, while local Apache tribes spoke in whispers about evil spirits that haunted the ridge and claimed travelers whose souls were trapped between worlds of living and dead. The research that she conducted in territorial records and newspaper archives revealed pattern of disappearances spanning decades, including ranchers, miners, travelers, and even occasional military patrols whose failure to return had been attributed to hostile Indians or natural disasters, despite absence of evidence for conventional explanations that might account for systematic loss of experienced frontiersmen who understood territorial dangers and possessed skills necessary for survival in hostile environment. The consistency of vanishings suggested supernatural rather than natural causes, while survivors' accounts included descriptions of ghostly figures and unexplained phenomena that challenged rational understanding. The interview that she arranged with Maria Santos, an elderly Mexican woman whose husband had vanished on Phantom Ridge 15 years earlier, provided first-hand account of supernatural experiences that paralleled her own encounters with spectral visitations and impossible occurrences that suggested spiritual connection between missing persons and their grieving families. Maria's description of ghostly stagecoach that had appeared to her on anniversary of her husband's disappearance included details that would later prove prophetic. While her warning about dangers of seeking answers to questions that human understanding couldn't safely address created apprehension that wisdom might require abandoning investigation. The Apache medicine man who agreed to speak with her after careful negotiation and presentation of gifts revealed tribal knowledge about Phantom Ridge that included ancient legends of spiritual trap that captured souls of those who died with unfinished business or unresolved love that bound them to earthly realm despite death's claim on their physical existence. His explanation of ritual requirements for spiritual rescue and communication with trapped souls provided framework for understanding supernatural experiences, while also warning about dangers that untrained persons faced when attempting to bridge gap between worlds of living and dead. The decision that crystallized through accumulated evidence and spiritual guidance was to perform vigil at Phantom Ridge itself during next new moon, when spiritual barriers were thinnest and communication with trapped souls was most likely to succeed, despite dangers that such contact might create for living persons whose life force could be drained by desperate spirits seeking escape from supernatural imprisonment. The preparation that such undertaking required included spiritual purification and acquisition of protective talismans, while emotional preparation involved accepting possibility that successful contact might provide closure through confirmation of Antoine's death rather than joyful reunion that her hope had maintained through years of faithful waiting. The spiritual preparation that Célestine undertook for her vigil at Phantom Ridge included fasting and prayer that purified both body and soul, according to ancient rituals that Maria Santos had learned from her grandmother, whose curandera knowledge bridged Catholic faith and indigenous spiritual practices through wisdom that frontier life had preserved, despite official disapproval from church authorities who considered such traditions dangerous superstition rather than legitimate spiritual practice. The 3 days of fasting were accompanied by meditation that focused her intentions while strengthening resolve necessary for confronting supernatural forces that normal human beings were not equipped to encounter without proper preparation and protection. The physical preparation required assembling items that Apache medicine man had specified as essential for protection and communication during spiritual encounters that could prove fatal for unprepared persons whose life energy might be consumed by desperate spirits seeking escape from supernatural imprisonment that bound them to earthly realm despite death's claim on their physical existence. The silver cross that had belonged to her grandmother provided Christian protection, while sage burning and prayer offerings created spiritual barrier that malevolent entities could not cross without permission that only desperate love could provide. The emotional preparation was perhaps most difficult aspect of undertaking that required accepting possibility that successful contact might confirm Antoine's death, rather than provide miracle reunion that years of hope had sustained through trials that would have broken lesser devotion, while her love for him demanded courage to seek truth, regardless of personal cost that knowledge might exact, from heart that had endured endless waiting for resolution that rational minds would have abandoned long ago. The letters that she wrote to family and friends provided final testimony to love that transcended death, while also serving as farewell in case spiritual journey proved fatal. The practical preparation included arrangements for ranch maintenance and livestock care during extended absence that vigil might require, while also ensuring that her affairs were properly ordered in event that spiritual encounter resulted in death or permanent disappearance that would leave no trace of her fate for concerned neighbors who had respected her choices despite considering them dangerously unrealistic. The will that she prepared left property to church with instructions for memorial that would honor both her devotion and Antoine's memory through charitable work that could benefit future frontier families facing similar tragedies. The final night before departure was spent in prayer and reflection that brought peace despite uncertainty about outcome of undertaking that could provide either miraculous reunion or confirmation of loss that would finally force acceptance of widowhood that rational grief should have achieved years earlier. When dawn broke over desert landscape that had witnessed her years of faithful waiting, Célestine mounted her horse with determination that exceeded fear while carrying supplies and spiritual protection necessary for confronting whatever supernatural forces had claimed the man she loved more than life itself, and whose return had become purpose that defined her existence in territory where love was often the only force powerful enough to challenge death's dominion over human happiness. The ride toward Phantom Ridge began in pre-dawn darkness that seemed appropriate for journey into supernatural realm, where normal rules of existence might not apply according to warning that Apache medicine man had provided along with protective rituals and spiritual guidance necessary for surviving encounter with forces that had claimed Antoine and countless others whose disappearances had created legend of cursed territory, where death claimed travelers without leaving trace of their fate or explanation for their vanishing that grieving families could accept with rational understanding. The landscape that surrounded Phantom Ridge reflected its supernatural reputation through features that seemed designed to inspire dread and discourage approach by sensible persons whose survival instincts would normally prevent venturing into territory where even Apache warriors traveled only when necessity demanded passage through region that tribal wisdom considered dangerous to both physical and spiritual welfare. The rock formations created shadows that moved independently of sun's position, while vegetation grew in patterns that suggested unnatural influence on growth that defied botanical explanation and created impression of watching eyes that followed travelers with malevolent interest. The approach to Ridge itself revealed evidence of supernatural activity that exceeded normal frontier mysteries through signs that challenged rational explanation while confirming tribal warnings about spiritual dangers that awaited unprepared visitors whose presence might attract attention from entities that existed between worlds of living and dead. The bones that littered certain areas belonged to animals that had died in apparent terror, while trees grew in twisted shapes that suggested exposure to forces that normal nature never produced through conventional environmental influence that scientific understanding could explain or predict. The camp that Célestine established near base of Ridge was positioned according to protective instructions that spiritual advisors had provided, while her careful arrangement of defensive talismans and prayer objects created sacred space that malevolent spirits could not violate without overcoming spiritual barriers that faith and proper ritual had erected for protection of living persons whose presence in supernatural territory made them vulnerable to attack by entities seeking escape from imprisonment that bound them to cursed location. The sage that burned continuously would provide early warning of spiritual approach while also maintaining purification necessary for safe communication. The waiting that began as sunset approached was accompanied by atmospheric changes that confirmed supernatural nature of location, while temperature fluctuations and electromagnetic disturbances that affected her compass and pocket watch provided physical evidence for spiritual activity that rational skepticism could not dismiss as imagination or frontier superstition that uneducated persons might accept despite absence of scientific basis for supernatural beliefs that civilized society had abandoned in favor of rational understanding of natural phenomena that excluded spiritual explanations for unexplained occurrences that challenged conventional wisdom about death and survival of consciousness beyond physical existence. The manifestation that began as midnight approached started with subtle changes in atmosphere that even rational persons would have noticed, despite skepticism about supernatural explanations for phenomena that challenged scientific understanding. While electromagnetic disturbances created aurora-like effects in cloudless sky that provided visual confirmation for spiritual activity that exceeded normal desert conditions through displays that resembled northern lights despite geographical impossibility of such occurrence in territorial Arizona, where atmospheric conditions could not produce such illumination through conventional meteorological processes that natural science could explain or predict. The sound that preceded visual contact was mixture of wind and voices that seemed to emerge from Ridge itself rather than any identifiable source, while whispered words in languages that she could not identify were occasionally interrupted by fragments of conversation in English that included names and phrases that suggested communication between lost souls who remained trapped in spiritual realm despite death's claim on their physical existence. The recognition of Antoine's voice among spectral chorus created emotional response that threatened to overwhelm spiritual preparation that was essential for maintaining protective barriers against malevolent entities. The appearance of ghostly figures began with translucent shapes that materialized from moonlight and shadow like memories given form through supernatural force that exceeded normal human understanding, while their movements suggested desperate urgency and unfinished business that bound them to earthly realm despite spiritual authorities' attempts to guide them toward peaceful rest that acceptance of death should have provided. The recognition that some spirits were attempting communication, while others seemed trapped in repetitive actions that recreated final moments of their earthly existence, revealed complexity of supernatural imprisonment that simple rescue attempts could not address. The moment when Antoine's spirit materialized with clarity that exceeded all previous supernatural encounters was accompanied by joy and terror that challenged emotional preparation for confrontation with beloved dead, whose presence confirmed both her faith and her deepest fears about spiritual imprisonment that had prevented his peaceful rest while binding him to location where death had claimed his physical form. His appearance was exactly as she remembered, except for sadness that reflected spiritual suffering and desperate need for resolution that only living person could provide through actions that might risk her own spiritual welfare. The communication that was established through supernatural means included Antoine's explanation of circumstances that had led to his death and spiritual imprisonment, while his description of supernatural trap that had claimed countless travelers revealed systematic spiritual predation that fed on life force of victims while binding their souls to cursed location through ancient evil that exceeded normal human capacity for resistance or escape. His urgent warning about immediate danger to her own spiritual welfare was accompanied by instructions for ritual that could provide his release while also destroying supernatural trap that had claimed him and others whose suffering demanded resolution that only living person with sufficient love and courage could provide despite personal cost that such spiritual rescue might exact. The explanation that Antoine's spirit provided about his fate revealed circumstances that exceeded simple death through supernatural encounter with ancient evil that had been imprisoned beneath Phantom Ridge by Apache spiritual leaders whose power had contained but not destroyed malevolent entity whose hunger for life force had been systematically claiming travelers for generations. His description of spiritual trap that had ensnared him included details about how entity fed on fear and despair while binding souls to its realm through emotional manipulation that turned love and hope into chains that prevented peaceful rest and spiritual progression that death should have provided. The history that was revealed through supernatural communication included ancient Apache legends about fallen shaman whose corruption by dark power had created spiritual abomination that exceeded normal evil through systematic predation on human life force and spiritual energy that sustained its existence while growing stronger through each victim whose soul became part of collective imprisonment that served entities' purposes. The ritual that had originally contained evil had been weakened by time and cultural disruption that white settlement had brought to tribal territories whose spiritual protection required continuous maintenance by medicine men whose knowledge was being lost through forced assimilation. The systematic nature of disappearances was explained through entities' careful selection of victims whose spiritual strength and emotional connections could provide maximum nourishment, while also ensuring that their loss would create grief and searching that brought additional prey to supernatural trap that fed on both victims and those who loved them. The pattern included targeting married persons whose spouses would inevitably seek answers, while single travelers were avoided because their disappearance would not generate emotional response that entity required for sustained feeding on human suffering and spiritual energy. The danger that Célestine faced exceeded simple risk to her own life through possibility that her spiritual energy could be consumed by entity whose hunger had been growing stronger through centuries of feeding, while her deep love for Antoine made her particularly vulnerable to manipulation that could transform her into additional victim whose spiritual imprisonment would serve dark purposes while providing entity with increased power that could eventually overcome original containment and spread its influence throughout territorial regions where unsuspecting populations could provide unlimited food for supernatural predator. The revelation that her years of faithful vigil had actually been strengthening entity through her grief and desperate hope created horror that challenged everything she had believed about love and devotion. While recognition that her supernatural experiences had been carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to bring her to this moment of maximum vulnerability forced her to reconsider whether rescue attempt was act of love or supreme folly that would doom both Antoine's soul and her own to eternal imprisonment in service of evil that exceeded human capacity for resistance or understanding of spiritual warfare that required knowledge and power she did not possess. The instructions that Antoine's spirit provided for ritual that could break supernatural bonds included precise requirements for timing, positioning, and spiritual preparation that would enable destruction of ancient trap while releasing imprisoned souls, despite personal cost that such undertaking would exact from living person whose life force would be required to power spiritual liberation that could not be achieved through conventional means. The complexity of ritual reflected sophisticated understanding of spiritual mechanics that Apache medicine men had developed through generations of warfare against supernatural threats that exceeded normal tribal concerns. The materials that were required included items that Célestine had brought according to previous spiritual guidance, while additional components could be gathered from Ridge itself where centuries of supernatural activity had created concentrations of spiritual energy that proper ritual could redirect toward liberation rather than imprisonment of souls whose suffering had become fuel for entity's continued existence. The silver cross that had protected her during approach would serve as focus for Christian power, while Apache sage and blessed water would provide purification necessary for confronting concentrated evil. The timing that was essential for ritual success required beginning ceremony precisely at moment when spiritual barriers were thinnest between worlds of living and dead, while atmospheric conditions and lunar positioning created temporary vulnerability in supernatural prison that skilled practitioner could exploit. Despite entities' resistance and desperate attempts to prevent loss of accumulated spiritual power that release of prisoners would represent. The window of opportunity would last only minutes before supernatural forces could reassert control and trap both rescuer and intended victims in enhanced imprisonment. The personal cost that ritual would demand included substantial portion of her own life force that would be required to power spiritual liberation, while successful completion would likely result in her death or permanent spiritual damage that would end her earthly existence despite achieving goal of freeing Antoine and other trapped souls from supernatural bondage. The choice between personal survival and spiritual rescue of beloved dead represented ultimate test of love that exceeded self-preservation through willingness to sacrifice everything for another's spiritual welfare and peaceful rest. The preparation that was completed during final hours before ritual included prayer and meditation that strengthened spiritual resolve while also providing opportunity for final communion with Antoine's spirit before beginning ceremony that would either free them both or doom them to shared imprisonment in service of evil that had already claimed too many innocent lives. When midnight approached, and atmospheric conditions reached optimal state for spiritual intervention, Célestine began chanting words that Apache medicine man had taught her while arranging ritual objects according to pattern that would focus supernatural forces toward liberation rather than continued bondage of souls whose suffering demanded resolution that only love could provide despite ultimate personal cost. The response from supernatural entity when ritual commenced exceeded every warning that spiritual advisors had provided about resistance that attempt at prisoner liberation would provoke, while concentrated evil that had been contained beneath Phantom Ridge erupted in fury that challenged protective barriers through assault, that combined psychological terror with direct spiritual attack designed to overwhelm human consciousness and prevent completion of ceremony that threatened its continued existence. The temperature plummeted despite desert heat, while electromagnetic disturbances created aurora effects that painted sky with colors that existed nowhere in natural spectrum. The manifestation of entity itself was accomplished through shadows that gained substance and intelligence while writhing with malevolent purpose that exceeded normal human capacity for evil through supernatural corruption that had accumulated spiritual power for centuries of feeding on human suffering and life force that provided sustenance for existence that transcended normal death through deliberate rejection of divine authority and natural spiritual order. The shapes that emerged from darkness suggested original human form that had been twisted beyond recognition through corruption that had consumed whatever goodness or mercy might have originally existed. The attack that was launched against Ritual Circle included systematic assault on Célestine's spiritual defenses through terror and despair that threatened to overwhelm faith and determination necessary for maintaining protective barriers while continuing ceremony that required absolute concentration despite supernatural interference designed to create confusion and fear that would enable entity to claim additional victim whose life force could power enhanced imprisonment that would make future escape attempts impossible. The whispered temptations and threats that filled her mind challenged every aspect of motivation and spiritual strength. The assistance that came from imprisoned souls themselves provided unexpected reinforcement for Ritual that was enabling their potential liberation, while Antoine's spirit and others began actively resisting entity's control through combined spiritual effort that had been impossible before living person had provided focus and power for organized rebellion against supernatural bondage that had seemed permanent and inescapable. Their participation in liberation effort multiplied effective ritual while also protecting Célestine from direct assault that would have overwhelmed individual resistance to concentrated evil. The turning point in spiritual battle came when accumulated power of ritual reached critical threshold that enabled direct confrontation with entity whose fury revealed desperation and recognition that its dominion was being challenged by forces that exceeded its capacity for resistance despite centuries of unopposed predation on human spiritual energy. The moment when supernatural prison began weakening was marked by earthquake-like tremors that shook Ridge to its foundations while creating visible cracks in reality itself that allowed imprisoned souls to begin escaping towards spiritual rest that death should have provided before supernatural intervention had trapped them in service of evil that was finally being defeated through power of sacrificial love. The cost that spiritual liberation was exacting from Célestine became apparent as Ritual reached critical phase, where her own life force was being consumed to power release of imprisoned souls, despite protective measures that had been designed to minimize personal damage from supernatural forces that demanded equivalent exchange of spiritual energy for freedom that could not be achieved without sacrifice from living person whose love provided motivation and power necessary for overcoming ancient evil. Her physical strength began failing, while spiritual energy flowed from her body into ritual that was enabling mass liberation. The vision that accompanied her weakening included glimpses of spiritual realm where Antoine and other freed souls were experiencing joy and relief that justified personal cost of ritual, despite recognition that her sacrifice would likely result in death that would separate them permanently unless spiritual authorities permitted reunion in afterlife that her actions had earned through supreme demonstration of selfless love. The beauty and peace that surrounded liberated spirits provided comfort that made approaching death seem worthwhile, despite everything she was losing through successful completion of rescue mission. The interference that entity attempted during final phase of ritual included desperate assault on her failing consciousness through promises of power and immortality that could be hers if she abandoned liberation effort and joined supernatural predator in continued feeding on human suffering that could provide eternal existence without death or separation from beloved, whose soul could be returned to imprisonment, along with others whose brief freedom would end if ritual was not completed, despite personal cost that completion would exact from rescuer, whose strength was nearly exhausted. The support that came from newly liberated souls included spiritual reinforcement that enabled her to resist final temptation while completing ceremony, despite failing physical condition and supernatural assault that was intended to prevent successful destruction of ancient trap that had claimed countless victims over generations of systematic predation on human life force and spiritual energy. Their gratitude and encouragement provided strength for final effort that would either complete liberation or doom all participants to enhanced imprisonment under entity whose power would be multiplied by failed rescue attempt. The moment when supernatural prison finally shattered was accompanied by explosion of light that temporarily blinded both physical and spiritual vision, while imprisoned souls streamed toward peaceful rest that death should have provided before ancient evil had trapped them in service that violated natural spiritual order and divine plan for consciousness after physical existence ended. The destruction of entity itself was accomplished through complete reversal of spiritual polarity that turned its accumulated power against its own existence while enabling mass exodus of victims whose freedom had been purchased through ultimate sacrifice that love had inspired despite personal cost that exceeded normal human capacity for selfless devotion to another's welfare above individual survival. The appearance of spectral Stagecoach as ritual reached completion was accompanied by recognition that spiritual transportation had been provided for souls whose liberation required passage to realm of peaceful rest that earthly death should have enabled before supernatural interference had trapped them in service of evil that was finally being destroyed through sacrificial love that had powered successful rescue mission. The vehicle itself was translucent but substantial enough to carry passengers whose spiritual forms required supernatural conveyance for transition from imprisonment to eternal rest, that divine mercy provided for consciousness that had suffered beyond normal human endurance. The driver of ghostly coach was revealed to be spirit of Apache medicine man, whose original containment ritual had been broken by time and cultural disruption, while his return to complete spiritual rescue that his people had begun generations earlier demonstrated divine justice that ensured evil could not triumph permanently despite temporary victories that patient malevolence might achieve through systematic predation on human weakness and suffering. His presence provided additional protection for newly liberated souls while also ensuring that entity's destruction would be complete and permanent rather than temporary setback. The passengers who were boarding supernatural transportation included Antoine's spirit, along with dozens of others whose disappearances had created generations of grief and mystery throughout territorial regions, where Phantom Ridge had claimed travelers without explanation that surviving families could accept or understand. Their joy and relief at liberation was accompanied by gratitude toward woman whose love had enabled their freedom despite personal cost that exceeded normal human capacity for selfless sacrifice in service of another's spiritual welfare above individual survival and happiness. The invitation that was extended to Célestine included opportunity to join spiritual journey toward realm, where earthly suffering could not reach souls whose liberation had been achieved through ultimate demonstration of love that transcended physical existence and personal preservation through willingness to sacrifice everything for beloved's spiritual welfare. The choice between continued earthly existence with permanent separation or spiritual reunion through death represented final decision that would determine whether her sacrifice would achieve complete fulfillment or remain forever incomplete despite successful rescue of imprisoned souls. The hesitation that preceded her decision reflected recognition that accepting invitation would end earthly life that ritual had already damaged beyond repair through spiritual energy that had been consumed to power liberation ceremony. While declining would preserve remaining life force but condemn her to permanent separation from man whose spiritual freedom had been purchased through sacrifice that love had inspired, despite personal cost that rational persons would have considered too great for any earthly relationship to justify. The moment when Antoine's spirit extended his hand toward her through open door of ghostly coach represented ultimate choice between individual survival and spiritual reunion that could only be achieved through acceptance of death that love had already made inevitable. The decision that confronted Célestine as ghostly stagecoach waited with supernatural patience was complicated by recognition that her earthly existence had already been fundamentally altered by spiritual sacrifice that had enabled mass liberation of imprisoned souls, while medical knowledge suggested that physical damage from ritual would likely result in gradual death, even if she chose to remain among living rather than accept immediate transition to spiritual realm where reunion with Antoine could provide eternal happiness that earthly separation had made impossible to achieve through normal mortality. The contemplation of alternatives included realistic assessment of life that would remain if she declined spiritual invitation, while her isolation and community perception of madness would make normal social integration impossible, despite heroic achievement that could never be publicly acknowledged or understood by persons whose experience had not included supernatural encounters that challenged conventional understanding of death and spiritual existence beyond physical mortality. The ranch that had been their shared dream would become empty monument to love that had transcended normal human limitations through ultimate sacrifice. The vision that was granted during moments of decision included glimpse of alternative future, where her continued earthly existence would be marked by increasing spiritual sensitivity that would make normal life impossible while enabling continued service as bridge between worlds of living and dead for persons whose suffering required supernatural intervention that conventional religion and medicine could not provide. The calling to serve as spiritual healer and guide would offer purpose that could justify survival despite permanent separation from beloved whose freedom had been purchased through sacrifice that love had inspired. The memory of years spent waiting for Antoine's return was transformed by understanding that faithful vigil had actually prepared her for spiritual service that could help other grieving persons find peace and closure through supernatural assistance that her experience had equipped her to provide despite personal cost that such calling would exact through continued separation from source of earthly happiness and fulfillment. The recognition that love could serve broader purposes through individual sacrifice created foundation for accepting continued life despite everything that acceptance would require her to abandon. The moment when she stepped back from ghostly stagecoach while declining spiritual invitation was accompanied by Antoine's understanding and approval of choice that would enable her to serve divine purposes through continued earthly existence dedicated to helping others find peace and resolution for supernatural problems that conventional authorities could not address. His farewell blessing provided strength for watching spiritual transportation disappear into supernatural realm, while she remained alone in desert, where her vigil had finally achieved its purpose through ultimate demonstration of love that transcended personal desire for reunion in favor of service to divine plan that required her sacrifice for benefit of future persons whose suffering would require supernatural intervention that her experience had prepared her to provide. The return journey from Phantom Ridge was accomplished in dawn light that revealed fundamental changes in both landscape and her own spiritual perception. While destruction of supernatural entity had restored natural order to territory that had been corrupted by centuries of evil influence, whose elimination was visible through immediate improvement in vegetation and wildlife behavior that reflected restoration of divine harmony to region, where ancient evil had been systematically disrupting spiritual balance through predation on human life force and supernatural imprisonment of innocent souls whose suffering had finally ended through sacrificial liberation. The homestead that she reached after exhausting travel bore evidence of supernatural visitation during her absence, while arrangements of objects and subtle changes in familiar spaces suggested spiritual blessing and protection that had been provided by liberated souls whose gratitude was being expressed through gentle intervention in physical realm, where their former prison was being transformed into sanctuary blessed by divine approval for heroic achievement that had served spiritual justice despite personal cost that sacrifice had required from living persons whose love had enabled mass liberation. The community response to her return was initially cautious due to her obvious physical weakness and spiritual transformation that had fundamentally altered her appearance and behavior in ways that frontier experience could not easily explain or understand. While her peaceful acceptance of Antoine's permanent departure created confusion among neighbors who had expected either triumphant reunion or complete breakdown, rather than serene resolution that suggested mysterious achievement whose nature they could not comprehend despite obvious change in woman who had been consumed by grief and desperate hope. The calling that was gradually revealed through supernatural sensitivity that ritual had awakened included ability to perceive spiritual distress and provide assistance to persons whose suffering involved supernatural elements that conventional help could not address through normal medical or religious intervention. The first requests for her assistance came from families whose own experiences with unexplained phenomena and spiritual disturbance required intervention from someone whose knowledge and capability exceeded normal frontier resources for dealing with mysteries that challenged rational understanding. The purpose that was emerging from her survival and continued earthly existence included establishment of spiritual healing practice that could serve territorial communities whose isolation and harsh conditions created vulnerability to supernatural problems, while limiting access to religious authorities whose training had not included practical experience with spiritual warfare and supernatural intervention that frontier circumstances sometimes required for protecting citizen welfare and community safety. The recognition that her sacrifice had purchased not only Antoine's freedom, but also calling to serve divine purposes through continued life, dedicated to helping others find peace and resolution for spiritual suffering that conventional assistance could not address, provided foundation for accepting survival despite permanent loss of earthly happiness. The reputation that developed around Célestine's spiritual healing capabilities was initially met with skepticism from territorial authorities whose scientific training and rational worldview could not accommodate supernatural explanations for phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. While her obvious sincerity and consistent success in resolving problems that medical and religious intervention had failed to address gradually created acceptance that her unique abilities served legitimate community needs despite methods that exceeded normal therapeutic approaches through direct spiritual intervention that produced results conventional treatment could not achieve. The cases that were brought to her attention included variety of supernatural disturbances that frontier conditions seemed to generate through combination of violent death, unresolved emotional trauma, and isolation that prevented proper spiritual resolution of conflicts that bound souls to earthly realm despite physical death that should have enabled peaceful transition to spiritual rest. Her ability to perceive spiritual distress and communicate with entities whose presence was creating problems for living persons enabled resolution through compassionate intervention rather than violent exorcism that many religious authorities considered necessary for dealing with supernatural manifestations. The methods that she developed for spiritual healing combined Apache wisdom that medicine man had taught her with Christian faith and personal experience of supernatural realm that ritual at Phantom Ridge had provided through direct encounter with spiritual forces that exceeded normal human understanding, but which could be approached through proper preparation and protective measures that love and divine blessing enabled trained persons to utilize for serving others whose suffering required supernatural intervention. Her treatments typically involved prayer, ritual purification, and mediation between conflicting spiritual forces that were creating disturbance. The training that she began providing to selected persons whose spiritual sensitivity and moral character qualified them for learning supernatural healing techniques created foundation for network of spiritual practitioners who could serve territorial communities whose isolation made access to specialized help difficult, despite increasing recognition that frontier conditions generated supernatural problems that conventional authorities were not equipped to address through normal medical or religious intervention, that required specialized knowledge and direct experience with spiritual realm that few persons possessed through personal encounter. The opposition that her healing practice encountered from certain religious authorities reflected doctrinal concerns about supernatural intervention that challenged official church teachings. While her obvious success and moral character made direct condemnation difficult despite theological objections to methods that exceeded conventional religious practice through direct spiritual communication and intervention that church doctrine considered dangerous or heretical despite beneficial results that could not be achieved through normal religious counseling and prayer that did not include supernatural elements beyond normal Christian worship and doctrine. The crisis that challenged Célestine's spiritual healing practice arrived through case that exceeded anything her previous experience had prepared her to address, when territorial marshal brought daughter whose possession by malevolent entity was threatening not only her life, but also spiritual welfare of entire family, whose desperate attempts to help their child had made them vulnerable to supernatural predation that was systematically destroying their faith and mental stability through sustained spiritual assault that conventional religious intervention had failed to alleviate despite extensive prayer and ecclesiastical attention from multiple denominational representatives. The examination that she conducted revealed scope of supernatural problem that exceeded simple possession through systematic spiritual warfare that was being waged against family whose members had unknowingly violated ancient spiritual protections while settling land that had been sacred to tribal peoples whose displacement had left supernatural guardians without proper maintenance and guidance from medicine men whose cultural knowledge had been lost through forced assimilation that disrupted spiritual balance and created vulnerability to malevolent forces seeking opportunity for renewed predation on human spiritual energy. The resistance that her initial intervention encountered demonstrated entities' power and determination to maintain control over victim whose spiritual energy was providing sustenance while also serving as base for expanded operations against territorial communities whose lack of spiritual protection made them vulnerable to systematic supernatural predation that challenged divine order through deliberate corruption of innocent persons whose suffering would generate additional opportunities for evil influence through family members whose desperation would make them susceptible to spiritual manipulation and eventual possession. The alliance that was formed with Apache medicine man, whose tribal obligations included protection of territorial settlers despite historical grievances, created unprecedented cooperation between indigenous spiritual wisdom and Christian faith through recognition that supernatural threats exceeded cultural boundaries, while requiring combined resources and knowledge that neither tradition could provide independently against evil that threatened all human spiritual welfare, regardless of ethnic background or religious affiliation, that might normally create division rather than cooperation in spiritual warfare. The ritual that was developed through collaboration between different spiritual traditions included elements from both Apache ceremonial practice and Christian worship, while incorporating lessons that Célestine's experience at Phantom Ridge had provided about systematic approach to spiritual liberation that required precise timing, proper protection, and willingness to sacrifice personal welfare for successful intervention against supernatural forces whose power exceeded individual capability for resistance, despite faith and determination that might enable temporary success against evil that organized resistance could defeat through combined effort and mutual support. The revelation that was uncovered through intensive spiritual investigation disclosed that Child's possession was merely preliminary assault in systematic campaign by supernatural forces whose organization and resources exceeded anything territorial communities were prepared to resist through conventional means. While their strategic coordination suggested leadership by entity whose power and intelligence had been accumulating strength through centuries of predation on human spiritual energy, that recent territorial development was providing through increased population density that offered expanded opportunities for supernatural feeding and influence. The intelligence that was gathered through spiritual reconnaissance revealed network of corrupted persons whose voluntary service to evil was enabling systematic infiltration of territorial government and religious institutions through possessed officials whose supernatural influence was being used to undermine spiritual protections and promote policies that would increase community vulnerability to supernatural predation while preventing effective resistance through elimination of persons whose spiritual knowledge posed threat to evil plans for territorial domination through systematic corruption of human institutions. The scope of supernatural conspiracy that was emerging through continued investigation exceeded anything previous spiritual warfare had encountered in territorial regions. While evidence suggested coordination with similar campaigns in other frontier areas where rapid population growth and cultural disruption had created optimal conditions for supernatural predation through systematic exploitation of spiritual vulnerabilities that isolated communities could not address without specialized knowledge and resources that conventional authorities did not possess, despite official responsibility for citizen protection and community welfare. The alliance that was being formed among spiritual practitioners from different traditions created unprecedented cooperation for addressing threats that exceeded individual capability, despite expertise and divine calling that qualified each practitioner for spiritual service within their respective communities. The recognition that evil was organizing systematic assault on human spiritual welfare required corresponding organization of defensive resources through network of healers and spiritual warriors whose combined knowledge and capability could provide effective resistance against supernatural forces whose power was being multiplied through strategic coordination. The preparation for spiritual warfare that circumstances were demanding required expansion of Célestine's healing practice into military-style organization capable of conducting sustained campaign against supernatural enemies whose resources and determination exceeded anything peaceful healing work had previously encountered, while her experience with sacrificial liberation at Phantom Ridge provided foundation for understanding that victory over organized evil would require sacrifice and commitment that exceeded normal human capacity for spiritual service despite divine support and protection, that faithful service to supernatural healing had earned through demonstrated courage and selfless devotion to others' spiritual welfare. The confrontation that determined outcome of spiritual warfare between organized good and evil was initiated when supernatural forces launched coordinated assault on territorial communities through systematic possession of key officials and influential citizens whose corrupted authority was being used to implement policies that would eliminate spiritual protections while preventing effective resistance from practitioners whose intervention threatened evil plans for domination through supernatural influence over human institutions and individual consciousness that demonic control could provide through systematic predation on spiritual energy. and systematic corruption of moral character. The battle that was waged in both spiritual and physical realms exceeded anything frontier experience had previously produced through combination of supernatural warfare and conventional conflict, as possessed persons used their official authority and social influence to organize violent suppression of spiritual healers, while demonic entities launched direct spiritual assault against practitioners whose knowledge and capability posed existential threat to evil plans for territorial domination through systematic elimination of resistance and establishment of supernatural dictatorship over human consciousness and spiritual development. The turning point in cosmic struggle was achieved when Célestine's network of spiritual practitioners succeeded in coordinating simultaneous intervention at multiple locations throughout territory, while their combined spiritual power enabled mass liberation of possessed persons whose freedom from demonic control eliminated evil's primary advantage through loss of human agents whose official authority had been essential for implementing supernatural agenda that required human cooperation for success against divine plan for territorial development and spiritual progress that organized evil was attempting to prevent. The cost that victory over organized evil exacted from spiritual practitioners included death of several healers whose sacrifice enabled successful completion of liberation campaign, while survivors, including Célestine, were left with permanent spiritual sensitivity that made normal social interaction difficult, despite heroic achievement that had preserved territorial freedom from supernatural domination and established precedent for organized resistance against evil forces whose threat to human spiritual welfare would require continued vigilance and systematic defensive preparation through network of spiritual practitioners whose calling served divine purposes. The victory that was achieved through coordinated spiritual warfare demonstrated effectiveness of organized good against supernatural evil when properly guided by divine authority and sustained by sacrificial love that enabled practitioners to risk personal welfare for community spiritual protection, while establishment of permanent network of spiritual healers created foundation for preventing future supernatural threats through systematic monitoring and intervention that could address evil influence before it achieved capability for systematic predation on human spiritual energy and consciousness that isolated communities could not resist without specialized knowledge and divine support. 5 years after the midnight when ghostly Stagecoach had carried Antoine's liberated spirit to eternal rest, Célestine stood once again on her porch in contemplation of desert that had been transformed from cursed wasteland into blessed sanctuary, where supernatural healing had established foundation for spiritual community that served territorial needs while honoring memory of sacrificial love that had enabled liberation of countless souls from supernatural imprisonment and protection of territorial communities from organized evil that had threatened human spiritual welfare and divine plan for territorial development through systematic corruption and supernatural predation. The network of spiritual healers that had grown from her initial calling now included practitioners throughout southwestern territories whose training and capability provided comprehensive protection against supernatural threats, while also offering healing and guidance for persons whose suffering required intervention that conventional medical and religious authorities could not provide through normal therapeutic approaches that did not include direct spiritual communication and supernatural intervention, that specialized knowledge and divine calling enabled qualified practitioners to utilize for serving others' spiritual welfare above personal consideration. The community that had developed around her homestead included families whose lives had been saved through spiritual healing and persons whose calling to supernatural service had brought them to sanctuary where training and mutual support could be provided for practitioners whose dangerous work required protection and encouragement. that isolation and social misunderstanding made difficult to maintain without fellowship of persons who shared similar experience and divine calling to serve others' spiritual needs, despite personal cost that such service typically required from dedicated practitioners whose sacrifice served divine purposes. The peace that had replaced years of desperate waiting and supernatural warfare exceeded anything earthly happiness could have provided through recognition that sacrificial love had achieved purpose, that transcended personal fulfillment through service to divine plan that utilized individual suffering and loss for accomplishing spiritual good, that exceeded private concerns while honoring memory of beloved whose spiritual freedom had been purchased through ultimate demonstration of love that had inspired cosmic victory over organized evil and establishment of spiritual sanctuary that would serve future generations. The vision that concluded her earthly service came during sunset prayer, when spiritual realm opened to reveal Antoine waiting in divine light that promised eventual reunion when her mission was complete, and earthly calling had fulfilled its purpose through establishment of spiritual healing tradition that would protect territorial communities and serve persons whose suffering required supernatural intervention, that only love could provide through sacrifice that transcended individual desire for personal happiness. When dawn broke over Desert Sanctuary, where love had conquered death and evil had been defeated through sacrificial service to divine purpose, Célestine's spirit joined eternal chorus of souls whose liberation had been achieved through love that exceeded human understanding, while inspiring others to choose service over selfishness and spiritual welfare over earthly comfort in territories where healing flourished, because one woman had loved enough to sacrifice everything for beloved's freedom and discovered that true love never dies, but transforms suffering into service and personal loss into divine victory that echoes through eternity, wherever courage meets compassion and individual hearts become instruments of divine love that heals supernatural wounds while protecting innocent souls from evil that love alone can defeat through sacrifice, that death cannot diminish and time cannot erase, in territories where love builds bridges between worlds and creates sanctuary, where healing flows like rivers through desert communities, whose spiritual welfare is protected by practitioners who learned from widow who waited in faith until ghostly Stagecoach carried her beloved to eternal peace and left her with calling to serve divine love through supernatural healing that transformed territorial wilderness into spiritual sanctuary, where love conquers all.